The morning Doc Briggs found the blood trail, the mountains were turning gold. That is the thing nobody warns you about when they send you to Kunar province. The violence and the beauty exist inside the same breath. The peaks of the Hindu Kush catch the first gray light before dawn and turn it into something that looks almost like peace. And the valleys below sit perfectly still, not the stillness of rest, but the stillness of a place that is waiting for you to make a mistake. Briggs had been moving fast for 11 minutes, boots finding the rocky floor of the drainage with the automatic certainty of a man who has crossed too many dark valleys in too many countries to think consciously about where his feet go anymore. His flashlight swept low parallel to the ground the way you sweep when you are not looking for something standing but something lying. Then the beam caught it. He stopped. Behind him, Salter nearly walked into his back. The trail was dark and wide and unbroken. Not a smear, not a splash. A continuous, deliberate line of dark red against gray stone that began somewhere ahead of them and ran backward into the darkness behind them, stretching back farther than either man's light could reach. Briggs crouched, pressed two fingers to the edge of the trail. Still wet, he stood slowly. Salter had already turned around, walking the beam of his light back along the trail, following it into the shadows step by step, farther and farther, until the darkness swallowed the light and the light could not find the beginning. He turned around. His face said everything before his mouth did. 2,000 meters, he said quietly, give or take. Briggs did not respond immediately. He was looking ahead. 40 meters out, something was moving, low to the ground. Pulling itself forward with both arms, one agonizing pull at a time, legs trailing uselessly behind it. Not being dragged by anyone, not being carried, not stopping. Moving on its own. He started walking faster. 31 hours earlier, Morgan Ellis was standing in a supply room at FOB Kestrel, trying to understand why her name was on a mission roster she had never signed up for. FOB Kestrel sat in the Peach River Valley in Kunar province, eastern Afghanistan, a rough collection of hardened structures and sandbag walls, pressed against the base of mountains that looked like they had been arranged specifically to make human beings feel small. It had been operational long enough that the soldiers cycling through it had developed a particular relationship with the place. Not affection, not comfort. The kind of familiarity you build with something that has tried to hurt you before and will try again if you let your attention wander. You learned where the sight lines were. You learned which sections of wall absorbed the most wind at night. You learned not to look too long at the ridgelines after dark because the ridgelines looked back. Morgan had been at Kestrel for 6 weeks. She was 26 years old, 5'4", 119 pounds. Brown hair pulled back and secured in a way that would not move under any field condition. Gray eyes that were quiet in a way that made people who did not know her slightly uncomfortable because the eyes of someone that young were not supposed to look that settled. She was a Navy corpsman, hospital corpsman, second class assigned to support the infantry battalion rotating through Kestrel, and she had not once in 6 weeks moved beyond the forward operating base perimeter. Until tonight. The duty officer had found her at 2,200 hours with a simple and unsatisfying explanation. Tyler Marsh, the corpsman assigned to this mission, the one who had trained with SEAL Team 3's task unit for 3 weeks, who knew every man by call sign and had built his kit around their specific operational patterns, had been taken off the roster. A broken wrist, equipment accident in the staging area 4 hours ago. 3 bones, the surgeon said. Clean breaks. 8 to 10 weeks minimum before field operations were possible. The mission could not wait. The intelligence had a shelf life measured in hours, not days. Someone had gone looking for a replacement. Someone had found Morgan's name on a list of female corpsmen currently on base who had completed the cultural support team screening process. She had passed every component of that screening 4 months ago in a different country, in a different season, and had not expected to be called. Not here. Not like this. She had 2 hours to prepare. She used them. What nobody at FOB Kestrel knew that night, what would not surface until a different kind of investigation concluded 72 hours later, was that Tyler Marsh's broken wrist had not been an accident. A message had moved through a cutout. Someone with access to the pre-deployment staging area had been given specific instructions. A shifted equipment crate, a particular weight, a particular angle, a particular moment when no cameras were covering that section of the staging room and no other personnel were in direct line of sight. 3 broken bones, and Morgan Ellis's name moved from the reserve list to the roster. The person who arranged it had needed a replacement, who did not know the team, who had no established movement patterns that could be anticipated, who would be an unknown variable inside an operation that was already being watched from the outside. What that person had not accounted for was what the replacement knew, what she could do, what lived in her hands below the level of conscious decision. But that accounting would come later. On the night she was called, Morgan knew only what the duty officer had told her, and she spent her 2 hours the way her father had taught her to spend any preparation time. Methodically, systematically, without hurrying and without wasting motion, she checked her EFAC. Tourniquet placement high on both hips where her hands could find them in total darkness, confirmed by feel 3 times. Combat gauze, chest seals both occlusive and vented. Morphine auto-injectors, 2 in the left chest pocket where her right hand could reach them without crossing her body. She checked the Beretta M9 on her right hip, not because she expected to need it, but because checking it was what you did. 18 months of carrying it, fired only at paper targets. The weight of it was familiar in a way that was not comfort and was not discomfort. It was simply there the way a piece of equipment is there, the way any tool is there when you have made a decision about when you will and will not use it. She had made that decision 6 years ago on a Tuesday morning, standing in a parking lot in Montana, holding a phone that had just told her that Master Sergeant Samuel Ellis, United States Marine Corps, 1st Reconnaissance Battalion Force Reconnaissance, was not coming home from Fallujah. She had been 22 years old. She had not cried immediately. That was the thing she remembered most clearly about that morning, not the grief itself, but the strange, efficient calm that preceded it, the way she had continued through the next hours, making phone calls and booking a flight and telling her supervisor she would need time, all with a steadiness that did not feel like strength and did not feel like numbness, but felt like something else entirely, something she did not have a word for. The grief arrived 3 days later, standing in her father's workshop in the garage of the house in Helena, touching his tools, and it arrived all at once and completely, and she sat down on the concrete floor and stayed there. He had left a letter. He apparently left a letter before every deployment. She had not known this until her mother placed the envelope in her hands. His handwriting on the front was precise and deliberate, the way everything about him had been precise and deliberate, and she had read the letter so many times in the years since that certain passages had become something beyond memory, installed in a part of her that did not degrade, that did not fade, that she could access at any hour under any condition. Near the end, he had written, "Your hands can save people. I have watched you understand things about medicine that doctors twice your age have not figured out yet. There is something in how you see a person, how you know where the damage is before anyone tells you. Do not ever let anyone tell you that being the one who heals instead of the one who fights is somehow less. It is not less. It is the harder thing." And then below that, in slightly different ink, as though added after he had already folded and sealed and then reconsidered. "If there ever comes a time when healing is not enough, you will know and you will do what needs doing. I trust you." Her mother had asked her in the weeks after the funeral before she flew back to Montana, and then eventually to her next assignment, to make a promise. Not to fight, to heal. To use what her father had taught her in the medical direction, not the other direction. Her mother had been 51 years old and had just buried her husband of 28 years, and Morgan had looked at her across the kitchen table and made the promise without hesitation. 6 years. She had kept it without difficulty because the situations that might have required breaking it had not arisen. Until tonight, she had not anticipated they would. She closed the flap on her kit, adjusted the straps, picked it up, settled the weight across her shoulders, and went to find the briefing room. 2 days before any of this, at 14:30 hours on a Thursday afternoon, Morgan had been sitting on a wooden bench outside the S2 intelligence office at FOB Kestrel, waiting for Captain Eldridge to sign a medical supply authorization form that had been routing through the administrative system for 11 days and showed no signs of arriving at a signature on its own momentum. She had been sitting there for 20 minutes. She was not impatient. She had her notebook open and she was reviewing tourniquet application timing from a case study she had been working through, and she was comfortable with the quiet of the hallway the way she was comfortable with most quiets. The door to the S2 office was not quite closed. She had not noticed this until the meeting inside was interrupted, until voices rose slightly with the specific quality of voices that have encountered a technical complication and are working through it without enough time to work through it calmly. Someone said they needed to reset the secure display. There was a pause. In the pause, a voice read, "Coordinates allowed, the way you read coordinates when you need them in the room's shared memory before the display goes dark. 8 digits. MGRS grid format, said once clearly at a volume calibrated for a small room with the door mostly closed." Morgan did not look up from her notebook. She was not trying to listen. She was not trained as an intelligence professional, had no context for what the coordinates referenced, had no framework for understanding their significance. The coordinates entered her mind the way a strong visual enters the mind, not as information being processed, but as a pattern being recorded. Her spatial memory had worked this way since she was a child, a capacity she had never decided to develop and had never fully explained to anyone the ability to hold numbers in spatial relationships with the clarity of a photograph. The door opened fully at 14:48. Captain Eldridge came out with the signed authorization form and an apology for the wait. Morgan thanked him, took the form, and walked back toward the medical station. She did not think about the coordinates again. She had no reason to. The briefing room held 16 people when Morgan walked in at 2300 hours. Master Chief Damon Voss was standing at the front of the room with a terrain overlay on the table and the particular posture of a man who has run this kind of operation enough times that the preparation for it has become a physical reflex. He was 44 years old, built like something structural rather than biological, with a jaw that looked load-bearing and eyes that had learned over 4 combat deployments to communicate only what was operationally necessary. He looked at Morgan when she walked through the door. The look lasted approximately 2 seconds. It contained no warmth and no hostility. It was a calculation, a rapid practiced assessment of an unknown variable entering a system that did not accommodate unknowns well. He returned to the terrain overlay without expression. Petty Officer Strix, seated to the right of the table, was less calibrated in his response. He was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders, with a directness that was not cruelty and was not kindness, but was simply the communication style of a man who had decided long ago that ambiguity cost more than it was worth. He waited until Voss had completed the initial terrain briefing before leaning toward the operator beside him, Eli Tanner, SEAL sniper, who had the stillness of someone who heard everything and filed it for later, and saying at a volume clearly designed to carry, "We bringing a medic or a liability?" Morgan did not look up from the map she was studying. Chief Holt, seated directly to her left, glanced sideways at her. He was 51 years old, the oldest operator in the room, with gray at both temples and a quality of quiet that was different from Voss's quiet. Voss's quiet was controlled. Holt's quiet was patient. There is a difference, and people who have been in enough rooms with enough men eventually learn to tell them apart. Holt watched Morgan not react to Strick's comment, and something small and considered moved behind his eyes. He said nothing. He went back to studying the overlay. The mission was Operation Quiet Ridgeline, the objective reconnaissance and intelligence confirmation of a suspected Taliban command node operating through a compound network in the mountains northeast of Kestrel. The element would infiltrate on foot during darkness, establish observation positions, confirm or deny the presence of the command element, and exfiltrate before first light. 12 SEALs, 2 Army Rangers, 1 civilian intelligence contractor named Harker, who would serve as local liaison coordinating information flow back to the FOB and Morgan. Morgan's role: medical support and cultural support assistance if the operation required access to Afghan civilian quarters. She was not there to carry a rifle. Strick had made this point to Voss before the briefing concluded, and Voss had agreed, and Morgan had said nothing about it. She had noted on the vehicle ride to the insertion point the location of every additional weapon in the transport, the way you note where the exits are in an unfamiliar building. Not planning, awareness. Sergeant Kane, one of the 2 Rangers attached to the element, had looked at her hands when she picked up her medical kit to move out. He was 28 years old, permanently sunburned from too much time at altitude, with the assessment reflex of someone who has learned to make quick evaluations without wasting time on politeness. "You good to carry that if we move fast?" he asked. "Yes," Morgan said, "because if it slows us down, it won't." Kane held the look for one additional second, then nodded and moved out. They departed at 0130 hours. The infiltration route took them northeast, climbing through terrain that punished the legs and the lungs in alternating measure, the kind of elevation gain that is not dramatic but is relentless. Each step a small negotiation with gravity that compounds over hours into something that lives in the thighs and the lower back in the deliberate rhythm of breathing. The path was narrow. The team moved in a loose column with night vision binoculars, turning the world into shades of green and gray. No talking. Hand signals. Pre-established radio protocols for specific contact scenarios. Only the kind of silence that becomes its own noise after a while, filling the spaces in your concentration with every sound the valley makes. Wind across stone, the distant sound of water moving somewhere below, the soft percussion of 14 sets of boots on rocky ground. Morgan moved in the middle of the column. Briggs and Salter, the team's medical element, moved 3 and 4 positions ahead of her. She maintained her own interval behind them with a consistency that generated no commentary because there was nothing to comment on. She watched the terrain the way her father had taught her to watch it, not focusing on any single point, but letting the whole picture come to her peripherally, the way you sometimes have to look slightly beside a dim star to see it clearly. She noticed things. She noticed at the 50-minute mark that something in Kane's gait had changed. It was subtle, a slight heaviness in the left leg that had not been present when they had departed, the kind of change that accumulates slowly and announces itself only after the damage is already compounding. She watched him for 40 minutes to be certain before she acted, because certainty was more useful than speed. When the person you were about to pull aside from a combat column had no reason to believe he needed pulling aside, she keyed her radio on the team medical channel, kept her voice at the level of breathing. Kane, drop back 30 feet. A pause. His shoulders shifted slightly before his voice came through. Say again, 30 feet off the main trail. Now. She could see the hesitation in his body before he stepped aside and let the man behind him pass, drifting back until he was walking beside her. She did not stop moving. She watched his face and the way he was distributing his weight across each footfall. How long has your left leg been heavy, she asked. It's fine. It's not. She kept her voice the same, not challenging, not sympathetic, simply informational, the way a gauge reading is informational. Right arm or left arm when you urinate. Any color change. Something shifted in his expression. The shift of a man who has been told something accurate about himself by someone he did not expect accuracy from. Little dark, he admitted, since yesterday afternoon. She was already reaching into the side pocket of her kit without breaking stride. She pressed a water bottle and 2 tablets into his palm. Drink all of that now, both of these after. When we stop, I need your blood pressure and temperature. What is it? Your muscles are breaking down faster than your kidneys are clearing the byproduct. Rhabdomyolysis. Early stage. If it were advanced, you would already be down. She looked at him steadily. Drink the water. He drank it. They walked another 100 meters before he said quietly, how did you spot that? I've been watching you for 40 minutes. The gait change is subtle. You didn't notice it yourself? No. Most people don't. That's the problem. She moved back to her position in the column. Ahead and to the left, she could see Chief Holt adjust his angle slightly, just enough to observe what had happened behind him before facing forward again. At the scheduled rest halt, Voss came back along the column to check his element. He found Kane sitting against a rock with Morgan's field blood pressure cuff on his arm, Kane watching her record a reading on her palm with a pen. Voss looked at the reading, then at Morgan. He's stable, she said. He needs to stay hydrated, and we need to monitor output. If he shows neurological signs, he needs to come off the mission. Voss looked at Kane. You good to continue? Yes, sir, Kane said. She caught it early. Voss held Morgan's gaze for a moment that was longer than strictly necessary. Not warmth, something different from before. He nodded once and moved back toward the front of the column. From 4 meters up the line, Strick watched the exchange. He said nothing. His jaw moved slightly, the way a jaw moves when a person is quietly reassessing something they had considered settled. They were 90 minutes from the objective when Morgan noticed the wind. It was a small change, the kind of shift in air movement that most people do not have language for, that registers only as a vague sense that something has altered without being able to name what. She had spent enough time on open ground as a child in the mountains of Montana, in the fields and the high meadows, in conditions that rewarded attention and penalized inattention, to read air movement almost without thinking. The way the valley funneled the current, the way the rock formations on the eastern ridge created a channeling effect at this elevation. The way the temperature drop of early morning interacted with specific terrain features to produce predictable movement patterns. She was thinking about sound and smell, and the way those things travel in conditions like this. But the part of her that had been quiet for 6 years heard something in the data she was processing, and her mouth moved before she could evaluate whether speaking was appropriate. The ridgeline is pushing northeast now, she said, to no one in particular, to the general space around her. If there are observation posts on the eastern face, our thermal signatures would be moving away from them rather than toward. Better approach angle would be from the secondary drainage, not the main track. Silence. She felt the quality of it immediately. What it meant, what she had just revealed without intending to. She stopped talking. Eli Tanner, 3 meters to her right, had not stopped moving. But his head had turned a few degrees in her direction, and in the green light of the night vision, she could see his eyes had found her. Not with suspicion, with the calm attention of a man filing a data point he expects to be useful later. Chief Holt, walking directly behind her, came alongside her for exactly 3 steps. He did not speak. When he pulled back to his original position, his hand briefly made contact with her shoulder, the lightest possible touch lasting less than a second. A communication that contained exactly one word. Noted. Morgan kept walking, kept her eyes on the terrain ahead, kept her face where she had learned to keep it in the particular stillness that was not absence of feeling, but management of it. 10 meters ahead, Strick caught the exchange. He glanced back at her once. His expression carried something she recognized, a question he was not asking yet, a category he was beginning to reclassify. The column continued northeast. The mountains continued their ancient, indifferent business of being beautiful. Morgan walked in the middle of it, carrying what she carried, keeping what she kept. She had no idea what was waiting for her 47 minutes ahead. The final rest halt before the approach lasted 9 minutes. Voss crouched with the terrain map confirming the last section of the route with Tanner and 2 of the senior operators. Holt pulled security to the north, moving to a position that gave him a sight line across the open section of ridge without silhouetting himself against the pre-dawn sky. Kane sat with his back against a rock, looking steadier than he had 2 hours ago. And when he caught Morgan's eye, he held it for a moment, a small, deliberate acknowledgement of something he did not have words for and did not need to put into words. Morgan was checking her kit, methodical, systematic. The way her father had taught her to check everything before anything happened, not because you expected the worst, but because preparation was the only form of confidence that was honest. Voss came to her at the 8-minute mark. He crouched so that his face was at her level, and his voice was low and without ceremony. The approach route passes through a section that showed IED activity 6 weeks ago. EOD swept it 2 weeks back. Should be clear. He held her gaze. Should be and is are different things. Understood. You stay in the middle of the column. You do not deviate from the path of the man ahead of you. One step to either side, you step back immediately. Understood. He studied her face for a moment, looking for something specific. Not reassurance. The thing behind her eyes that had opened briefly when she spoke about thermal signatures that had closed afterward like a door shutting. He did not find it because she did not let him. You did right with Kane, he said. He would have pushed through it and gone down at the worst possible moment. Yeah, Morgan said. Voss stood. Stay tight. He moved back to the front of the column. Morgan let out a breath so small it barely counted as a breath. She reset her pack, adjusted the straps with 2 practiced movements, and looked up at the mountains. In the east, at the upper edges of the highest peaks, the darkness had just begun its reluctant conversion towards something that was not yet gray, but was no longer purely black. 0447 hours. The column moved out. The path narrowed as they entered the final drainage. Rock walls rose on both sides, channeling the column closer together, closer than any of them wanted to be in terrain like this. The kind of ground that makes experienced men quieter and more watchful, without anyone giving an order to be quiet and watchful. When the terrain funnels you, something older than training tells you to pay attention. Morgan watched the ground. She watched it with the same peripheral attention she had used on the ridgeline, not fixing on any point but letting the whole picture register. Color texture, the way disturbed material settles differently from undisturbed material, the way a surface that has been interfered with holds the record of that interference if the light hits it from the right angle and the eyes are in the right state. They had been moving for 6 minutes. At 0453, Morgan registered something. It arrived the way an error registers, not as an alarm, but as a friction. A vague wrongness in the small patch of ground near the inside edge of a low rock formation, 2 feet ahead and to the right of the natural walking line. The color was not matching the surrounding stone. The texture of the surface near the base of the outcropping had the slightly too smooth quality of material that had been disturbed and resettled not by wind or water, but by hands working quickly in poor light. Her foot was mid-stride. The thought arrived. The foot continued moving. The pressure plate registered 11 pounds per square inch. The device beneath it had been placed by someone who understood the geometry of the drainage, who knew where a column of people moving in darkness would place their feet, who had waited for exactly this weight distribution in exactly this position. The detonation took 0.3 seconds from contact to full pressure wave. Morgan did not hear it. People almost never hear the one that gets them. What she knew next was the ground, cold rock against her face, the weight of her kit across her back. A sound in her ears that was not sound, but the absence of all other sound, a high ringing void where the world had been. Her vision was gray at the edges and narrowing inward. Above her, between the rock walls of the drainage, the sky was still that color that is not quite black and not quite dawn, the color of a moment just before anything has been decided. She tried to move her legs. She understood immediately that something was wrong. Both legs below the knee were gone. The information arrived without ceremony, without the softening that comes with shock in the way people who have never experienced serious trauma imagine it arrives. It arrived with the clinical clarity of a fact being presented to someone trained to receive facts and act on them without the delay that feeling requires. She did not look. She did not need to look. Some information you process without confirming it visually because the confirmation costs you something you cannot afford to spend. She could hear returning through the void in her ears the sound of small arms fire from the ridgelines on both sides. Close. Multiple positions. The distinctive pattern of a coordinated ambush, not improvised contact, but planned sequenced fire designed to drive a column into a fixed position and hold it there. She could hear voices cutting through the chaos ahead. Voss's voice, specific and commanding. She had been separated from the column. The explosion had done that. She was in the open in the middle of the drainage with rock walls on both sides and fire coming from above. And the team was ahead and she was alone. She had approximately 2 minutes, possibly less, before blood loss reached the threshold where her ability to think clearly would begin to degrade. She knew this the way she knew her own name. She had written this fact on a whiteboard for other people. Her hands were already moving. Left tourniquet first. The cat was on her left hip exactly where she had placed it at the rest halt, and her fingers found it without searching because the hands do not forget what the mind has practiced past the point of retrieval. She set it high and tight on the left thigh above the point where the structural integrity of the leg ended, and she cranked the windlass. The pain arrived in a shape she had no previous reference for. She bit down on it not because she was trying to be tough, but because screaming costs oxygen, and oxygen costs time, and she did not have time to spend on anything that did not move her forward. Right tourniquet. Her hands knew this motion the way hands know things that have been practiced past the level of conscious retrieval. The right tourniquet set, she reached for the morphine auto-injector in her left chest pocket and held it there for exactly 1 second. The hesitation of a medic calculating, not panicking. The benefit of pain management against the risk of a pressure drop in hemorrhagic shock. She made the call, pressed the injector to her outer thigh, felt the click of deployment. 45 minutes of functional coverage, maybe 50 given her body weight. The sky above the drainage walls was still that color between black and gray, still the color of a moment before anything has been decided. The radio on her chest had taken fragment damage on the left side. She could hear incoming transmissions. The transmit function was intermittent, sometimes working, mostly not. She pressed the talk button and said her call sign twice. No acknowledgement came back. She released the button and listened. Voss's voice came through the static in fragments, and she assembled the picture from the pieces the way you read a damaged document, filling the gaps from context and from the logic of the situation. The team element had been driven northeast, a box canyon. The ranger element that had been operating separately in the valley had linked up under fire, which meant the total count of personnel now pinned without egress was 40 men. Air assets were unavailable, confirmed man-portable air defense systems on the upper ridgeline, which made helicopter approach a death sentence for any crew that attempted it. The situation required resolution before daylight made their position untenable, because daylight in a box canyon with elevated enemy positions on 3 sides was not a situation that resolved in your favor. 40 people. Morgan looked at the map she carried in her head, not as reference material, but as landscape, as a place she had already been in her mind before her feet arrived the way her father had always told her to memorize maps. The distance from her current position to the mouth of the box canyon along the safest navigable route, accounting for the secondary IED indicator she had flagged on the approach and not yet had the opportunity to report, was approximately 2,000 meters. She looked at that number. Then she thought about Voss's voice on the radio. She thought about Kane sitting against that rock with his blood pressure dropping and catching it early enough that catching it mattered. She thought about 40 people in a canyon with daylight coming and no other way out. She looked at the ground in front of her. She found the direction. She put her forearms flat against the cold rock and she started to pull. One pull, then another, then another. The morphine did not remove the pain. What morphine does what she had explained to patients in clinical settings with a detachment of someone on the instructional side of the equation is change your relationship to it. It moves the pain to a different room and closes the door, and you can still hear everything happening in that room, every impact and every sharp edge and every sustained note of damage, but you are no longer required to stand in the center of it. You can work. You can think. You can put your forearms against the rock and pull yourself forward because the thing that needs doing has not changed simply because your body is no longer cooperating. She understood this clinically. She had never experienced it from this side of the explanation before. She started counting. Every time her right forearm contacted the ground and she dragged her body forward, she covered approximately 40 centimeters. She counted in sets of 25. 25 pulls was 10 meters. 10 meters was a number she could track against the map in her head, against the distance remaining, against the margin between what her body had left and what the situation required. Her father had told her this, not about crawling injured across an Afghan valley. He had told it to her on a mountain in Montana when she was 12 years old on a steep section of trail where she had made the mistake of stopping and looking up at how much remained in the distance had made something go hollow in her chest. He had been 4 steps ahead and he had turned around without her saying anything because he always knew, and he had come back down to where she was and crouched in front of her on the slope. "Don't look at the top," he had said. His voice carried perfectly in open air. "The top doesn't exist yet. Look at the next step." She had wanted to argue. She had been 12 and the mountain was very large. She had also been smart enough to know when Samuel Ellis was telling her something worth keeping. They reached the summit 40 minutes later. She was pulling herself across the floor of a valley in Afghanistan 14 years after that afternoon, and she was looking at the next pull, and his voice was so specific and so complete in her memory that it occupied the same mental space as a physical presence, the way a strong memory can be almost tactile, almost real enough to reach. She had covered approximately 200 meters when Tanner's voice came through the radio. It was not a frequency she expected to hear from him. His position was on the high ridge line to the northwest, maintaining overwatch across the canyon where the team element was pinned. That he was reaching her on a secondary channel meant he had been watching and calculating and had something specific to say before she had reason to make decisions without it. "Ellis, Tanner, you have a patrol converging from your northeast. 3 individuals, 8 minutes. I don't have a shot from this position without giving up overwatch on the canyon." She stopped moving, pressed herself lower against the rock. The body has a capacity to flatten itself when the survival instinct speaks that most people do not discover until they need it. 3 sets of boots on loose stone. She could hear the acoustic pattern now, people descending a slope in the dark, moving carefully, but not carefully enough, the specific sound of men who are looking for something and expect to find it. They were not moving the way a post-strike patrol moves. She had been thinking about this since Voss's first transmission, the way the team had been driven into the canyon and held there rather than pressed. An ambush element that strikes and holds is not maximizing the advantage of chaos. An ambush element that strikes and holds and sends a patrol into the drainage on a search pattern is looking for something specific, something it was told to find. Tanner confirmed it on the next transmission. "The patrol in the drainage is not sweeping for casualties," he said. "The behavior pattern is a capture operation. They have prior knowledge of your route and your timing. That information came from inside Kestrel." A pause on the line. Then Harker checked out a communications handset from the FOB, inventoried at 1845 yesterday evening. There is an active frequency signature in the valley matching that handset's identification code. She lay still for a moment. Harker had been in the briefing room. He had been at the insertion point. He had known the route, the timing, the composition of the element, the corridor through which they would move. He had known all of it because his role required him to know all of it, and someone had looked at a man carrying a weight he could not put down and had offered him a way to put it down, and the weight had been heavy enough, and the man had been desperate enough that he had taken the offer before he fully understood what taking it would cost everyone around him. She would learn the rest later. The failed business, the compounding debt, the loan that had started as a lifeline and become a leash, the channel that had looked like financial rescue until it was too late to see it as anything else, the leverage that made refusal feel impossible and compliance feel like the only door still open. She did not know any of this yet. She knew only that the patrol was 8 minutes out and that the blood trail behind her ran 200 meters back into the open ground of the drainage. She controlled her breathing. 4 counts in, hold for 7, 8 counts out. She had learned this from a retired Marine gunnery sergeant who ran a range outside Missoula and who had taken her on as an informal student when she was 16 because her father had called in a favor. She had learned the breathing for rifle work. She used it now for staying alive. The 3 men came into visual range as the light at the top of the drainage walls began its first reluctant brightening. Dark clothing, moving carefully down the slope, armed. Sweeping their lights at ground level, following the blood trail from the near end, working backward toward its source. Toward her. The light from one of the flashlights swept to within 6 feet of her position. She did not move. She was not breathing. The light moved on. 40 seconds later, the voices moved away. Boots on loose stone fading back up the slope, diminishing into the general sounds of the valley, waking up around them. She let the breath out. She found the direction. She continued. At the 400-meter mark, Tanner came back on the radio. His voice had the same quality it always had, flat, precise, without the small emotional textures that most people's voices carry, whether they intend them to or not. When Tanner communicated, the communication was the content, nothing more and nothing less. Morgan, there is something you need to know before you have reason to make decisions that don't account for it. She pulled herself to a stopping position behind a low rock formation and settled her weight against it. Go ahead. The Taliban element in this valley had prior knowledge of your route before the element arrived. The timing window, the corridor, the composition. That information came from inside Kestrel. He paused for exactly the length of time that constituted a breath rather than a gap. The patrol was not sent into this drainage to sweep for casualties. It was sent to execute a retrieval. She lay still. Not of a random element member, a specific individual. You. She had been thinking about this in the background of her mind for the last hour, the way patterns assemble themselves when you give them the space to not, by forcing the analysis but by letting the pieces find their own arrangement. The road deviation that had brought the column through this specific drainage rather than the parallel route. The IED, positioned with knowledge of how a column moves, knowledge of where the fourth person's foot would fall on that particular piece of ground. The patrol that had struck hard and then held that had driven the element into a canyon. Rather than pursuing that, had sent a search team into the drainage rather than a kill team. All of it connected to one information problem. Someone had known. Someone had known enough to engineer this specific outcome. And the outcome was not 40 men dead. The outcome was 40 men contained and one specific person alone, and incapacitated in the drainage, and a retrieval team moving toward her position. The IED was not placed to kill me, she said. No, Tanner said. It was placed to stop me. Yes. She thought about the S2 office, the door that was not quite closed. The 8 digits read aloud in a room that was supposed to be secured. The 30 seconds during which information that was not meant to leave that room had left it and entered the one place where it was least expected to be. The grid coordinates, she said. Yes, Tanner's voice was careful and exact in the way of someone delivering information whose full weight he is not softening, but is also not dramatizing. You were the only person in that hallway during the session break who was not credentialed. You were there for administrative reasons. No one in the intelligence section registered your presence as a security consideration. No one had any reason to. She understood the shape of it now, the coordinates she had not been trying to memorize, the information she had not understood the significance of. Sitting in that hallway with her notebook open present for the wrong 30 seconds and walking away carrying something she did not know she was carrying. Someone had found out. Someone had told the people who needed to know. And the people who needed to know had built an entire operation around retrieving a 26-year-old Navy corpsman from a drainage in Kunar province because she had been sitting on the wrong bench at the wrong time with a memory that did not distinguish between information she was supposed to retain and information she was not. The grid is accurate, she said. I have it complete. I know you do, Tanner said. That is why you need to get out of this valley. She put her forearms against the rock. Working on it, she said. She started pulling again. At the 800-meter mark, she stopped to assess the left tourniquet. Standard clinical guidance allowed for a brief release after 90 minutes to evaluate limb circulation and reduce the risk of tissue damage. She was past 90 minutes on the left, closer to 105, and the clinical guidance did not change because the circumstances that made following it inconvenient were severe. She released the left tourniquet for 2 minutes. She counted every second. She watched the bleeding and felt what the change in circulation did to her body's remaining resources, and she made the call at 117 seconds because the data was sufficient. She reapplied. She had approximately 30 minutes of useful morphine coverage remaining. After that, the pain would be present without mediation. She thought about this the way a navigator thinks about fuel, not with fear, but with calculation. 30 minutes of coverage, 1,200 meters remaining. Her current pace was approximately 40 meters every 10 minutes. The math was not good. The math had never been good. That had not been the point. At 940 meters, Tanner's voice came back. His tone had shifted in the specific way a precise man's tone shifts when the information he is carrying requires more than information. Morgan, 3 individuals northeast of your current position quartering back across the drainage floor. Converging angle puts them at your position in approximately 9 minutes. I still do not have a shot from my current overwatch position. She stopped. A pause and then, is there a weapon at your location? She thought about the column formation. Kane had been directly behind her. In the contact and the chaos that followed the detonation, Kane would have been driven in the direction of the team element back toward the canyon mouth, away from the IED, away from her position. He would have moved to cover fast, leaving whatever he could not carry. Check your 6, Tanner said. Approximately 4 meters. Kane was directly behind you. She turned, moved backward away from every meter she had accumulated, away from the direction of everything she had been building toward, and covered 4 meters of ground she had already paid for once. Her hand found the M24 into the darkness. She stopped moving. She lay there with her hand on the rifle, and she looked at it in the growing gray light for longer than the tactical situation allowed. Tanner, watching through his scope from 1,200 meters away, saw her stillness. He had watched a great many people over a great many years through high-powered optics, and he understood the specific quality of this particular stillness. It was not hesitation born from fear. It was not the paralysis of someone unable to act. It was the stillness of someone confronting the accumulated weight of a decision that had been made a long time ago and had been held and carried and kept, and that was now pressing against the present moment with the full force of everything it had cost to keep it. 6 years. A Tuesday morning in a parking lot in Montana. An envelope with her name in precise, deliberate handwriting. A kitchen table, and a mother who was 51 years old and had just become a widow asking for one thing, and Morgan looking across the table and saying yes without hesitation, because at that moment, yes was the only honest answer she had. She picked up the M24. She checked the chamber and the action with movements that did not consult her conscious mind before executing. They were simply there the way her father's voice was simply there in her memory, without being called, without being invited, already present. Her left elbow found the ground, the bipod seated against the rock formation. Her right eye found the scope. Tanner said wind is running northeast at 4 to 6 knots. Gusting at elevation, but you are in the drainage, so it will run steadier than the ridge reading suggests. The 3 men came into the drainage from the north, moving in a loose spread, their lights unnecessary now in the strengthening gray morning. Moving with the awareness of men who know they are looking for someone and are confident they will find her. 650 meters, 640, 630. Morgan found the natural point of aim. She adjusted for the slope of the drainage floor and the angle that created at distance. She thought about wind northeast 4 to 6 knots steadier in the drainage, and she translated that into the manual correction her right hand made to the elevation turret, the small, precise movement that her father had drilled into her until it became a reflex rather than a calculation. She fired. The shot went left, 3 feet at least, striking the rock face beside the lead man. All 3 scattered immediately to cover with the speed of men who have been in this situation before and know exactly what the initial movement needs to be. Tanner's voice came through, flat and immediate. Slight left wind influence at that range in the drainage. Adjust right. Morgan cycled the bolt. She could feel the tremor in the barrel, not from technique, but from blood loss and cold, and a body running on reserves that were being spent faster than they could be replenished. The kind of shake that lives below the level of conscious control. She breathed. 4 counts in, hold for 7, 8 counts out. She breathed until the tremor settled into something smaller, something she could work around, and then she breathed until it settled further still. The 3 men were relocating. She could see their movement, the careful lateral shifts of people who have taken cover and are now orienting toward the origin point of the shot, working the problem of finding her position without exposing themselves to a second shot. She watched. She waited. She let the stillness come back through everything that was trying to prevent it. She fired. 680 meters adjusted for wind, adjusted for the angle of the drainage floor, fired from a non-standard position by a person running on borrowed physiology and a 6-year-old memory, and the voice of a man who had died in Fallujah when she was 22 years old. The lead man dropped. The other 2 men moved back up the slope with the focused, efficient movement of people who have recalculated a situation and found it no longer favorable. They did not stop to recover anything. They did not expose themselves to verify what had happened. They moved, and they continued moving until they were gone. Tanner exhaled on the radio. She heard it. He kept his scope on her position for a long moment. He had questions. He had a significant number of questions, and none of them belonged on a tactical radio channel. He filed every one of them. 680 meters, he said finally. I want to note that. There was a pause before she answered. First shot missed, she said. The wind correction on the second was manual. She lowered the rifle. She watched the slope for 30 seconds, making certain. Then she turned back to the ground ahead and kept moving. Doc Briggs found her at the 1,840-meter mark. He had been moving fast and low through the drainage for 11 minutes following the intelligence Tanner had pushed down to the team element in the canyon. The position estimate, the direction of movement, the rate of progress that Tanner had described on the command channel with a single word that was accurate and also the least of what it was. He had done 3 tours. He had seen what pressure plate devices did to legs. He was moving as fast as the terrain allowed and trying not to think about what he expected to find at the end of a blood trail that had been running without interruption for close to 2,000 meters. He had not expected her to still be moving. He covered the distance between them at a run. She heard him coming. Her right hand moved to the M24 before he got within 10 meters, and he had the presence of mind to call his name and unit clearly and without urgency. Briggs SEAL Team 3 friendlies because she was not in a condition to receive surprises safely. The hand came off the rifle. She put her forehead against the rock for 1 second. 1 full second, eyes closed, forehead against cold stone. The only moment in what he would later calculate as approximately 2 hours of continuous movement where she allowed herself to stop completely. Then she lifted her head. Her gray eyes found his face and they were clear despite everything. Not the clarity of someone who has not been through something, but the clarity of someone who has been through something and is still here. Tourniquet status on both legs, she said. Her voice was lower than he had expected, but it was steady. Left is at approximately 140 minutes. Right is at 150. I have been cycling on the left. The right I have not been able to reach in the last 40 minutes. He was already beside her, his kit open. Let me work. I'll talk you through it while you work. He reached for the morphine in his kit, and she said no. And he looked at her, and she held his gaze and explained the calculation, pressure, drop, risk against the 15 minutes of clear thinking. She needed the math of one against the other, the conclusion she had already reached. After the team is out, then morphine. He put it back. She pushed herself up onto her forearms. I need to be forward to call the path. I have the IED indicators mapped from ground level on the approach. No one else has that picture. Can you build a carry that keeps me face down? Salter was already pulling the emergency poncho from his kit. They built the carry in 90 seconds. Not elegant, functional, which was what it needed to be. Briggs at the front, Salter at the back. Morgan face down between them on the stretch material, elevated enough to see the ground ahead, low enough to stay below any sight line on the ridgelines. Move on my mark, she said. When I call stop, stop immediately. When I call a direction move, the full team that direction, without questioning the call in the moment. Understood, Briggs said. She looked at the terrain ahead of her, the 360 meters of drainage floor between where they were and the canyon mouth. It looked to the uninformed eye like ordinary ground rock and dirt and dried scrub, the kind of surface you would cross without slowing if you did not know what it held. She knew what it held. Move, she said. The first stop came at 70 meters, a section of disturbed earth at the inside edge of a rock shelf positioned at the natural walking line, placed by someone who understood that people under pressure moved toward the path of least resistance. The disturbance was subtle, a shade difference in soil color that required context to read, the kind of thing you saw from ground level that you could not see from any other angle. Left 4 feet, full team, she did not explain. They moved left. They continued. The second stop came at 210 meters. This device had been placed under time pressure probably in the hours immediately preceding the ambush by someone working fast with degraded light conditions. The pressure plate edge was just visible where the settling of the soil over the device had not yet matched the surrounding surface. Right 8 feet. Hold that line for the next 20 meters. They held it. At 280 meters, Voss's voice came through the radio. Tanner says you are at the approach to the canyon mouth. We are ready to move on your signal. She scanned the remaining ground. 80 meters of open drainage floor wider here, where the canyon spilled into the valley. She looked at the ridgelines. She looked at the shadows at the upper edges, at the rock formations that would offer cover for a secondary firing position, at the way the morning light was now falling at a low angle that created specific visibility conditions for anyone watching from elevation. Give me 30 seconds, she said. She looked at the last 80 meters, the way her father had taught her to look at a shot. Not at the target, but at everything between her position and the target. Every variable the terrain introduced. The angle of morning light backlighting anyone moving from the canyon mouth. The eastern ridgeline's overhang at the 200-meter mark, the only real covered position with the sight line to cover their movement. Tanner was already there. She knew this because Tanner was the kind of person who would be there before anyone thought to ask. She keyed the radio. Tanner the overhang at 200 on the eastern ridge. 2 seconds. Then covered. She switched to Voss. 20 abreast as wide as the terrain allows. Move fast and spread the signature. Do not funnel. The canyon mouth opened. 40 men came through it in the controlled and purposeful way of people who have been told exactly what to do by someone they have decided to trust. Rangers and SEALs moving together without ceremony, spreading across the available width of the drainage mouth, wounded men supported by unwounded men. The entire element crossing the open ground in a sustained movement that gave any observer on the ridgeline a targeting problem instead of a target. 4 shots came from the eastern ridgeline, not the overhang high or a secondary position that had not been visible from any ground-level perspective she had access to. A position she had not seen because it could not be seen from where she was. Briggs dropped with her fast the carry going to the ground. She heard 4 returns. The M483's unmistakable report, deliberate, precise, with the rhythm of someone who is not hurrying because hurrying is not required. 4 times. In a rhythm that was not hurried. The shots from the ridge stopped. Nothing more came from that position. Voss was at her side in 20 seconds. He moved low and fast across the open ground, the way a man moves when the shooting has stopped. But the situation has not yet confirmed that the shooting has stopped. Permanently crouched, deliberate, covering the distance between himself and the carry, with the efficiency of someone who has closed ground under fire enough times that the body does not require instructions for it. He crouched beside her. He looked at her face. He looked at the carry. He looked at the length of the blood trail behind her stretching back through the drainage into the growing morning light, 2,000 meters of dark red against gray stone marking every pull she had made in the dark. He did not speak for a moment. All 40 out, she asked. All 40. 6 wounded, none critical. She processed this. Voss was quiet in the way of a man who has something to say and is deciding how, which was unusual, because Voss was not a man accustomed to uncertainty about his own speech. The route you called, he said finally. The IED positions. I mapped them on the approach. Ground level gives you different indicators than aerial or overhead review. The EOD sweep was 2 weeks old and fresh placement reads differently from age placement. You mapped them in your head. I didn't have paper. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Not warmth, something that had replaced whatever had been there when she walked into the briefing room the night before, something more considered, more specific. The look of a man who has updated his understanding of a situation and is sitting with the update. The shot at 680 meters, he said. Morgan did not respond immediately. Tanner logs everything, Voss said. He doesn't log things that aren't accurate. The habit of not speaking about this was deep enough that overriding it required active effort even now, even here lying on a makeshift carry in the bottom of a drainage in Kunar province with both legs gone below the knee. My father taught me, she said finally. I stopped when he died. I was 22. She looked at Voss directly. I made a promise to my mother. I have been a corpsman for 6 years. I intended to stay one. Voss absorbed this. He was quiet in the way of someone processing new information about the shape of the world. Not the facts of it, which he had already updated, but the shape of it, the way things fit together in a configuration he had not previously considered. You saved 40 lives in this valley, he said, counting Kane from last night. The counting doesn't change what I did to do it. No, he said. It doesn't. He reached to his chest. He unpinned the Naval Special Warfare insignia, the anchor, the eagle, the trident, the flintlock pistol, the device that the community called the Budweiser, that represented a selection process so demanding that 2/3 of candidates did not finish it, that no one in that community passed to anyone else without the weight of what it meant pressing behind every movement of their fingers. He set it on the ground beside her right hand. He did not make a speech. He stood and moved back toward on his team. Chief Holt came next. He stood over her for 3 seconds. He looked at the trail behind her the way a man looks at something that has settled a long argument he has been having with himself. Then he set his water bottle beside her left hand and walked away. No ceremony, no words. He had been the first one to see it that night on the ridgeline when her mouth had moved before she could stop it, when the words about thermal signatures and approach angles had come out before the part of her that managed these things had caught up. He had touched her shoulder and said nothing, and she had understood what he meant. She knew. He knew she knew. The water bottle said the rest. Strick came after Holt. He stood over her with an expression she could not fully categorize, not the skepticism from the briefing room, but whatever had replaced it. Something that looked like a man confronting the distance between what he had assumed and what had turned out to be true, and finding that distance uncomfortable and choosing not to perform comfort he did not feel. I said things before the mission, he said. You did. I was wrong about what I said. She looked at him steadily. You were doing your job. You needed to know whether I was an asset or a problem. You didn't have information. You made an assessment from what you had. She paused. So did I. He was still for a moment. What did you assess? That you were good at your job and fair enough to change your mind when the evidence changed? Something in his face shifted. The small shift of a person who has been assessed accurately by someone they underestimated. He nodded once, walked away, did not look back. It was the right ending for that particular conversation, and she recognized it as such. Kane arrived last. He moved carefully on his left side, the graze on his forearm, wrapped in a field dressing that Morgan had already noted was loose at the proximal edge. He crouched beside her the way someone crouches beside a person they are not sure how to address, not because they do not have things to say, but because the things they have to say feel inadequate to the moment, and they know it, and they are not willing to pretend otherwise. Twice, he said. She looked at him. You got me last night, and you got all of us this morning. That's twice. The rhabdomyolysis was going to surface regardless. I found it before it found you. That's not nothing, he said. That's actually the whole thing. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands the way people look at their hands when they are assembling words that matter. My wife's name is Catherine. My kids are 6 and 8. Her father was a medic in Korea. He used to say the medics were the ones who held the whole thing together, that without them, the rest was just machinery. He looked at her directly. He was right. She held his gaze. She did not redirect this, did not soften it, did not reach for the deflection that was available and that she had used in other moments with other people. Some things you receive fully because the person offering them needs you to receive them fully, and receiving them is itself the action that the moment requires. Go get that arm properly dressed, she said. The field wrap is loose at the proximal edge. He looked at his arm, looked back at her. Of course you noticed that. He stood. Walked toward Briggs. The morphine went in 4 minutes later. This time she did not argue. The world softened at its edges in the specific way that morphine softens things, not removing the present, but pulling its sharpest angles back. By a degree, allowing something that was not rest, but was adjacent to rest, to become possible. She looked up at the sky above the drainage walls. It was fully light now, the blue-gray of a high-altitude Afghan morning, the kind of light that does not flatter anything but illuminates everything honestly. She asked Briggs for paper and a pen. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into his kit and tore a section of cardboard from the inside of a supply wrapper, the only paper available in the field, the kind of surface you used when you needed to write something and nothing better existed. He handed her a field pen. I have grid coordinates that need to reach the S2 at Kestrel before the intelligence window closes, she said. 8-digit MGRS. I need this on paper, and I need chain of custody confirmed. He held the cardboard steady. She recited the coordinates. She recited them once clearly at a pace that allowed accurate transcription. Then she recited them a second time with the digits in 2 of the groups transposed, then corrected herself aloud, the field verification method her father had shown her for confirming recall accuracy under stress. If the second recitation produced the same transpositions in the same places and the same corrections, the memory was consistent. Both recitations matched perfectly. The coordinates in her head were exactly what they had been when she was sitting on that bench outside the S2 office, waiting for a signature on a supply authorization form. She folded the cardboard and pressed it into Briggs's hand. Chain of custody, she said. Your hand to the S2's hand, nobody else between. He closed his fingers around it. Copy. She put her head back against the rock. She let the morphine continue its work. Above her, the sky of Kunar province held its morning color, the particular blue-gray that arrives after something has happened and the world has not yet decided what comes next. She was unconscious before the extraction helicopter reached them. The UH-60 Blackhawk came in low and fast up the valley 43 minutes later, running nap of the earth to stay below the threat envelope until the last possible moment before flaring into the landing zone. Morgan heard it in the brief lucid interval before the crew reached the carry. She had learned to identify rotary aircraft by sound, years before she had ever seen the inside of a military installation, another of the things that lived in her below the level of formal training. The Black Hawk's distinctive rotor signature, the way it bounced differently off valley walls than open ground. She was loaded onto a litter for the move to the aircraft. She did not argue about the litter. There was a line between managing your situation and performing stoicism for no operational purpose, and she had located that line clearly enough in the last 3 hours to know which side of it she was on. Voss walked with the litter to the helicopter door. He did not have to do this. He did it. At the door, he put his hand briefly on her shoulder, one clean, deliberate contact, and that was all. The door closed. The aircraft lifted. Through the window, visible for a few seconds before the helicopter banked northeast toward Kestrel, and then beyond to the forward surgical team, she could see the drainage below. A long, pale scar in the darker ground of the valley. The morning light at its low angle catching every variation in the rock surface, illuminating the full length of what she had crossed. 2,000 meters of ground that looked different from altitude than it had felt from the floor of it. She closed her eyes before the valley disappeared behind the first ridgeline. She had done what she had come here to do, which was not the thing she had been sent here to do, which was not the thing anyone had expected her to do. She had done all three anyway. She let that be enough for now. She slept. 72 hours after the Black Hawk lifted from the drainage, Morgan was on the table for her second surgery at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. She was not conscious when the B-1B Lancer out of Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar reached its release point over a compound network in the mountains northeast of FOB Kestrel. The crew had been flying for 4 hours. The targeting package they were executing had been built in the preceding 48 hours from a single source of intelligence, 8 digits of grid reference confirmed twice through field verification protocol, delivered by a corpsman on a litter to a SEAL medic written on cardboard, torn from a supply wrapper, carried by hand from a drainage in Kunar province to an S-2 officer waiting in the doorway of a forward surgical tent. The Lancer carried 2 GBU-31 Joint Direct Attack munitions. Both found their designated coordinates within 4 meters of the specified point. The compound network was subsequently confirmed to have housed the Taliban command element responsible for coordinating operations throughout the Kunar corridor for the preceding 14 months. 14 individuals of senior operational significance. The strike was logged in the subsequent after-action documentation as the most consequential single intelligence-driven action in the Kunar region for the calendar year. Morgan did not know any of this when it happened. She was in her second surgery. She was not conscious for the strike itself, nor for the hours that followed when the initial confirmation reports began arriving at the intelligence section. She was conscious 4 days later in the recovery ward at Landstuhl when a signals intelligence officer from the S2 shop arrived at her bedside, sat in the chair beside it, and delivered a 2-sentence summary of the outcome, the target, the result, the confirmation status. He stated the facts. He thanked her. He left. She lay with that information for a long time, a piece of cardboard with 8 digits written on it, a bench outside a door that was not quite closed. 30 seconds during which the wrong person was in the wrong hallway at exactly the right moment. The specific cascade of accidents, in arrangements, in coincidences, in choices that had placed her in that drainage on that morning. All of it, every piece of it, running forward to a B-1B, releasing ordnance over coordinates that existed nowhere except inside her memory. The investigation into Harker had concluded by then. What emerged did not match the picture she had initially assembled. Harker had not been a man who chose betrayal casually, who had made the calculation that what he was selling is worth what he was receiving. He had arrived in Afghanistan already carrying a situation that had been collapsing for 2 years. A failed business, a second mortgage taken at the wrong point, in the wrong market. A personal loan from a source that had appeared legitimate until the terms began changing in ways that legitimate sources do not change terms. He had been approached through a channel that had not revealed its ultimate affiliation until the relationship was established and the leverage was sufficient to make the revelation feel like a door closing rather than a warning. By the time he understood what he was inside of, the cost of extraction had become higher than the cost of compliance. That calculation, made by a frightened and exhausted man in a bad situation not entirely of his own making, had produced consequences that spread outward from his decision to 40 people in a canyon and 1 person in a drainage, and a country that would not know for years, if ever, what had almost been lost on a September morning in Kunar province. Morgan thought about Harker more than she expected to in the weeks that followed. Not with forgiveness. She was not certain that forgiveness was hers to offer, and she was not certain she would offer it if it were, but with something that was not forgiveness and was not absolution and was not excuse-making. Something closer to the understanding of a specific shape, the shape of being trapped, the shape of watching choices compound until the landscape of available options has been reduced to a corridor so narrow that moving through it feels like the only thing left to do. She was still giving. She intended to keep giving. The cost of that had changed. The commitment had not. The right leg the surgeon at Landstuhl had told her with a direct and unembellished delivery she had appreciated was a different story from the left. The left leg below the knee was not recoverable. She had known this from the moment of detonation, had assessed it herself in the first seconds of consciousness in the drainage, and made the operational decision that followed from that assessment without letting the fact of it consume resources she needed for other things. The right leg had sustained significant damage, but retained structural viability. With time and with work, the surgeon said she could have that one back. I know, she had said. I felt the difference in the acute phase. He had studied her for a moment with the expression of someone encountering a category that required recalibration. You assessed all of this while it was happening. I'm a corpsman, she said. It's what I do. 6 months later, the room at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, where Morgan held the first session of the Integrated Combat Medicine course, was not large. It held 18 people comfortably, and on the first morning it held exactly 18 Navy corpsmen, 6 Army medics, and 3 Air Force pararescuemen, ranging in age from 22 to 34, seated in the specific attentive posture of people who have been told that what they are about to hear is worth their full attention, and who have decided provisionally to believe it. Morgan stood at the front of the room. She stood straight. She had relearned straight standing over 4 months with a physical therapist named Carver, who did not accept approximations and who treated complaints about difficulty with the professional indifference of someone who has calculated that indifference is a more effective treatment than sympathy. She wore her uniform with the same precision she had always worn it. The silver star sat among the ribbons at her chest, not positioned prominently and not minimized, simply present the way things that are true are present without requiring emphasis. There was a slight asymmetry in her posture from the prosthetic on the left side, a difference in the way her weight distributed across the standing position. She did not try to conceal it. Concealing it would have required a performance of normalcy that she did not have time for and would not have found honest. She wrote 6 words on the whiteboard behind her. Heal when you can, fight when you must. She drew a line under those 6 words and wrote 2 more below it. Know the difference. She turned back to the room. This course is not about dual qualification in the traditional sense, she said. It is not about turning medics into shooters or shooters into medics. It is about something that is harder than either of those things. She looked at the room, not at individual faces, but at all of them, simultaneously, the way she had learned to look at terrain. It is about understanding that the hands that apply a tourniquet to a femoral bleed and the hands that put a round on a 600-meter target are the same hands. Knowing when to use each set of skills and making that transition without losing either capability is the thing that makes you worth having in a team. She paused. Some of you have been in situations where healing was not enough. Some of you have not been there yet, and you will be. The question this course is built around is not whether you are physically capable of both. You are. The question is whether you understand deeply enough why you are doing either one to make the right call in the moment when both options are in front of you. She moved to the table at the front of the room, moving without self-consciousness about the prosthetic, without the careful management of someone aware of being observed. She was aware of being observed. She chose to be unaffected by it because being affected by it had no operational value. We will spend the first week on assessment, not assessment of the situation. Assessment of yourself, your physical limits and your technical limits, and the gap between where you are and where the situation will eventually require you to be. She looked at the room. That gap is not a problem. That gap is the curriculum. Kane had requested a transfer to the instructor cadre for the first run of the course, and the request had been approved with a speed that suggested endorsement above his current command. Afterward, he found Morgan in the hallway. His left arm still moved with a slight stiffness at the point where the graze had healed imperfectly, a stiffness that orthopedic consultants told him might diminish with time and might not. He had decided not to spend energy on the question of which outcome it would be. First class, he said, what did you think 17 of the 18 have operational experience? They don't need to be convinced the material matters. They need sequencing to understand what order the components build in so that each skill reinforces the next rather than competing with it. She looked at her notes. The Air Force PJs are ahead of the group on the integration piece. The Army medics will need more time on the decision framework. She paused, and the 18th Kane asked. She had noted him all morning, 22 years old, 3 months out of his credentialing course. The specific look of someone who knows they are behind the others and has not yet decided whether the gap is closable. The look of someone sitting at the edge of a question rather than in the middle of an answer. She had watched him because of what she saw underneath the uncertainty, the quality of attention he was bringing to the material, the way he listened. He's going to be the best in the room by week 3, she said. He's paying attention at a level the others have to remind themselves to sustain. The others are experienced, and their experience is valuable, but experience can also teach you to filter out things that don't fit your existing model. He doesn't have that filter yet. He's taking everything in. Kane smiled. You spotted that from the front of the room. My father called it reading the room, she said. He meant any room. A mountain, a valley, a briefing hall. She gathered her materials from the table. It's learnable. That's the first thing I'm going to tell him tomorrow. She walked out into the hallway. The November morning outside the corridor windows was gray and cold, the kind of cold that is not dramatic but is persistent, that gets into the spaces between things and stays. She had rebuilt her relationship with cold over the past months, in the way you rebuild a relationship with anything that has been complicated, not by pretending the complication did not exist, but by spending enough time in the presence of it that the charge dissipates. Montana had established early in her life that cold was manageable. Cold had always been manageable. She found a quiet space near the end of the hallway where a window looked out over the grounds of Walter Reed, and she stood there for a moment with her coffee and took her phone from her pocket. Her mother answered on the second ring. Morgan. Her mother's voice carried the specific quality that certain voices carry when they belong to someone who represents in the most uncomplicated and irreducible sense the sound of home. Not the place, the fact of it, the condition. You sounded tired last time. It was a long morning, good long. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Your father used to say that, the good kind of tired. Morgan looked out the window. The grounds were quiet in the gray morning. People crossing the paths between buildings, each of them carrying whatever they were carrying in the way that people at Walter Reed carry things, not always visibly, but present, the weight distributed into the way they hold their shoulders and set the pace of their steps. Mom, she said, I broke the promise. She had said this before. In the weeks immediately after Afghanistan and the first calls from Landstuhl, when she had still been working out how to hold the events of that morning alongside everything else she was holding. But she said it now differently, not as confession, not as apology, but as the completion of a picture she had been giving her mother in pieces and wanted her mother to have whole. In the drainage there was a rifle. I used it. I don't know that I would make a different choice if I had the day over. I know, her mother said. I've always known you might have to. The line was quiet for a moment, in the way that lines between people who love each other are quiet, not empty, but full of things that do not need words because they have been understood for a long time without them. I made you make that promise because I was afraid, her mother said. After your father, I was so afraid. Not of losing you, I mean that too, but that wasn't all of it. I was afraid you would spend your whole life carrying something you were never allowed to put down. I hoped the moment would never come where it mattered. What should you have hoped for? Her mother took a breath, that when the moment came, you would do exactly what you did. She paused. He was right about you, Morgan. He was right about everything he wrote in that letter. Morgan stood at the window and held the phone and let that sit inside her without redirecting it or qualifying it or setting it at a distance. Some things you receive fully because the person giving them is giving them from a place that cannot be argued with and should not be. She stayed on the call for another 12 minutes about Catherine and the kids, about whether Kane's arm was improving, about the view from the Walter Reed cafeteria in the morning, which was not spectacular, but was consistent, which was its own virtue. When she ended the call, she stood at the window for a while longer, with the phone in her hand looking out at the gray November grounds. She thought about her father. About a letter written in 2 different inks, the second part added after he had already finished. After whatever it was that made him pick the pen back up and put one more thing in before sealing the envelope. She did not need to recite it. She had not needed to recite it for years. It was simply there the way he was simply there in the part of her that did not degrade, that did not fade, that she could access at any hour under any condition. She thought about a drainage in Kunar province, about cold rock against her face in a sky that was the color of a moment before anything, about the count 25 pulls at a time, 10 meters at a time, one step, and then the next because the top does not exist yet, and the only thing that exists is the next step. She thought about the sound of 40 men moving through a canyon mouth at dawn. She put her phone in her pocket. She finished the cold coffee without complaint. She turned from the window. Down the hallway, 17 experienced operators and one 22-year-old who did not yet know that he was going to be the best in the room, were waiting for the afternoon session. She walked back toward the classroom without hurrying. On her desk beside the door, a briefing folder sat with a timestamp of 0800 the following morning. She had looked at the cover sheet when it arrived. She had looked at the operational area designation and the date. She had thought about a September morning in Kunar province and about what it had cost and about what it had bought. She had closed the folder. She had set it at the corner of her desk where she would see it first when she arrived in the morning. Some things you do not decide all at once. Some things you decide by walking toward them one step at a time in the same way you cross 2,000 meters of dark ground, not by resolving to cross the full distance, but by putting your forearms down and pulling again and not stopping, because the thing that needs doing has not changed simply because the distance is very long and the ground is very hard and the night is very dark. You do not apologize for the shape of yourself when the shape has proven under the specific pressures of a morning that tried to kill you to be exactly what was required. She walked into the classroom. The afternoon light through the windows was thin and flat and honest. She began.